Why, hello, my loves, and welcome back to Spook Manor. Are you here for yet another burning tale? Well, I have quite the fiery one for you. It is a story about a young man who has it all, yet is still yearning for his 15 minutes of fame and a life's purpose. In his public attempts at virtue signaling, he ultimately exploits and humiliates those who are most in need. But there is a lesson learned in all of this, and our charming Elijah's capitalization on the suffering of others comes with flaming consequences. Would you care to join me as we make our way down a road to hell that is paved with good intentions? Then let's begin. Elijah is a young man of 21, a California child born and raised, a trust fund kid who always has whatever he needs right at the tip of his fingertips. He has a particular passion for doing what he believes is the right thing, even though he doesn't always know what the right thing is due to his lack of life's experiences. With the flame of youth burning in his heart, he had become restless in his comfortable and pampered environment. He is ready for a change, and the time is now. Let's take a moment here to fully understand young Elijah. It is important to recognize that he has dreams of fame, which is common among people his age, and he is willing to do whatever it takes to get it. While at the same time, he wants to do something that will make the world a better place. A naive man, yes, though one with a good heart. Elijah has friends who had become social media sensations by way of masquerading an impoverished facade. Homelessness in California was a big topic on the news, and he believed the subject would bring many caring individuals to his new YouTube channel. Elijah was inspired and ready to make a name for himself, and what better way to do it than to raise awareness by faking homelessness? It is in the hills of Ojia, California where our story begins. Elijah has been out on the streets for about 3 months now. He was happy to walk out the door, despite his mother's hysterical protests, but his father was somewhat amused by the idea and reassured him that he would always have a home and funds available to him if he needed it. Elijah had learned a lot about homelessness in that time and often would opt for fancy hotels rather than actually sleeping in the streets with those who were genuinely suffering. He was happy to take money from the kind and generous people who felt compassion for him and his fellow vagabonds. He used everyone around him as an example. He used the suffering, the generous, and the cruel people he encountered to further his cause. He filmed everything without regard to their individual plights and never fully realized that he was simply exploiting them by posting humiliating and degrading scenes. He always called the same Uber driver at around 3 a.m. each night, someone he trusted to pick him up when he was finally ready for sleep. They had become good friends in Elijah's mind, but it was a bought friendship. Elijah paid good money for his nightly routine, and Xavier, the driver, was more than happy to comply. On one particularly dark night, Elijah encountered a rather nasty individual with a harsh addiction problem. The man was clearly aggressive and became enraged when he caught Elijah filming him. Elijah made a quick and narrow escape, but it left him shaken. Sitting in the back seat of the Uber, he finally felt safe, but hesitant to resume his escapade after the dangerous ordeal. He confided in his friend about his concerns and that he needed a break from the darkest examples of the problem he was desperately trying to expose. It was then that Xavier spoke up. You know, there's homelessness in the hills too. You could take a break by showing that, he said with concerned confidence. I know a place where you could catch something real wild for your channel. Something strange and paranormal, he added while glancing in the rearview mirror. Paranormal? Elijah asked with curious skepticism. Yeah, man, I saw it for real. Almost every time I go down that road. And it never shows up on my dash cam either, Xavier replied with enthusiasm. You see, what happens, he added before Elijah cut him off. Wait. Don't tell me. I want to find out for myself. Can we go there? Will I be in danger? He asked with excitement. Xavier shrugged, and they sat in silence for a long moment. You will have to camp out, but I've never seen anyone there. At least, not a living person anyway. And there are no reports of anyone being hurt that I know of. Sure would make a good video, though, if you caught it, Xavier finally replied with a twinkle in his eye. On that note, Elijah agreed, and the next night, Xavier dropped Elijah off at a very specific location on Creek Road. It was a cozy little spot, right next to an old bridge covered in graffiti. It was an ideal location to capture the vibe of his video. It was dusk, and Elijah was ready for the night's adventures. Or so he thought. He made a tiny flame in a can to set the scene for his video, and turned his back on the small fire to talk to the camera about the woes of homelessness. After a few moments had passed, he noticed an intense smell of something burning. Quickly, he whipped around to find the can had fallen over, and that the fire was beginning to spread. Even though it was only a small fire, Elijah panicked and began calling for help. "Fire! Fire! Someone help me!" he hollered while throwing his jacket over the small burning pile of sticks and twigs. Upon reviewing the film, he felt embarrassed about his overreaction to such a tiny thing. Looking at the spot where the fire had been, it is likely passerbys would never have even noticed it. A bit shaken, Elijah set up his phone again to film the time-lapse of the night. But to his amazement, somehow the battery had suddenly died. And oddly, his backup batteries were dead too. Frustrated that the night had become a total waste, he wrapped up in his sleeping bag and tried to get some rest. As he began to drift off, he heard the sound of someone running and an occasional scream of a man off in the distance. The sound would come close to his campsite and then would run off again. Elijah sat frozen, hoping it was nothing more than a deer. But it didn't act like a deer. It was definitely a person. For a long time, he sat with his racing heart. Finally, he got up to take a look. He followed the footsteps for a short distance and watched the deep woods closely. It was challenging to tell the difference from what was real and what was his imagination. It was then that he noticed something hanging from a tree about 50 yards away. It looked like a grown man, hanging by his feet. A shadow figure approached it with a large knife and began to take a swing at the lifeless, dangling form. Suddenly he felt an intensely hot burning sensation on his back, and the smell of burning wood and flesh overwhelmed his senses. Quickly he turned around, and the woods were filled with a treacherous wildfire. Elijah began to scream as the fire wrapped around him. Turning to run from the inferno, he saw the shadow man with the knife now running towards him. The man's face was charred and blackened, as though he had barely escaped the massive flames. In the blink of an eye, the man knocked Elijah to the ground and disappeared into the wall of flames behind him. The impact of Elijah hitting the forest floor boomed like a terrifying sound of a horrific car crash. Startled into consciousness, he jumped to his feet and began patting out the fire that wasn't there. It was then that he realized it was only a very vivid and realistic nightmare. But he could still feel the heat, and turned around to see a motorcycle had crashed in a flaming heap on the other side of the bridge. Quickly he ran over to see if he could help the poor man laying beside the burning wreckage. With all his strength, Elijah ran across the bridge, screaming for help along the way. But when he reached the other side of the bridge, the wreck was gone. No flames, no motorcycle, and no person in sight. It had all simply disappeared. Elijah was completely shaken and had become hysterical. He wondered if he had eaten something psychedelic, or if he had in fact completely lost his mind. Suddenly he heard a voice call out from the other side of the bridge. A man was standing there in a 1960s style suit, but his face was hidden by the shadows of the trees. The strange man called out, "It's fun to scare them, but they will kill you for it." Elijah started to walk closer to the man. "Did you see that? Did you see that wreck?" Elijah called out. The man began to walk towards him without speaking. Elijah was scared, but hopeful that he could get some help. It was then that the man's face could be seen by the light of a distant house. It was grotesque, deformed, with what appeared to be numerous tumors. Elijah completely freaked out and ran from the man as fast as he could in the opposite direction. He ran down the center of the roadway and stopped only when he saw another man running through the forest towards him. It was the man with the charred, blackened skin. Each time Elijah thought he had escaped him, he would reappear beside the road and throw rocks or sticks before rushing back into the woods. Elijah was exhausted, mentally broken, and crying hysterically. His heart was pounding, pain was shooting through his legs, and sweat pouring down his face. Finally, he saw a car approaching and threw himself onto the roadway so that it could not pass. The sound of screeching tires ripped through the night, and Elijah had passed out completely as he lay staring at the headlights in front of him. When consciousness finally came back to him, he was surrounded by flashing lights, police and medical personnel. He could hear a middle-aged woman talking with one of the officers. "I was so scared. I thought it was the Char-Man. I almost left him here, but he didn't disappear like the man usually does," she said while wiping tears from her eyes. The medics wheeled Elijah into the ambulance, and they began to make their way towards the hospital. Elijah softly asked one of the medics, "Who is the charred man?" The medics looked at each other. His condition appeared to be stable now. He responded to their questions logically and with great respect. He continued to politely pressure them for answers, and finally one of them spoke up. "It's just an urban legend. There was a terrible forest fire here back in 1948. Many homes were devastated. Legend has it that when responding officers went out looking for people who were lost, they apparently came upon a man who had been burned to a crisp, hanging upside down from a tree. His son, who had also been caught in the fire, had lost his mind because of the trauma, and at the sight of his incinerated father, he tried to remove the burned skin to save him. When officers tried to help the son, who was also a horribly burned victim, he is the one they now call the charred man, he took off running into the woods and was never found." Records show that no one actually died in that fire, but to this day there are still reports of a blackened, charred man who tries to stop cars on the roadway by throwing things at them. They say if you stop your car there and call out for help, he will come. But every time you try to catch him, the police arrive, or someone stops to help, he always escapes by running back into the woods. It is believed he is a ghost. "So that's who that was," Elijah thought to himself. When Elijah left the hospital the next morning, he called his Uber driver, Xavier. Getting in the car, he asked, "So, who is the Char-Man?" Xavier chuckled. "Why, you see him?" When Elijah didn't answer, and Xavier could feel the weight of the circumstance fill the air, he explained. There are a lot of different stories about who the Char-Man is. Some say he burned in a wildfire with his father, but there are also reports of a motorcyclist who died in a flaming wreck at the same spot. Then in the 1960s, there was this man who had really bad skin cancer and couldn't afford to treat it. He scared people so much but with his deformity that he had to walk his dog alone at night. Rumors started to fly, saying he liked scaring people and got a bad rap. Apparently, a group of guys didn't like this, and one night, they killed him in the same area. These deformed men are said to try to stop people on the road for help, but no one ever does, because the ghosts are too frightening. It's a very haunted location. There are even more ghosts reported to be stuck there, but I don't know much about them. I only know a few stories, you know. Elijah sat in a long silence before saying, "It's terrible that people would be so cruel to someone in such a horrible condition." Xavier responded, "Yeah, but what you gonna do? If those guys in the stories weren't so scared to ask for help, maybe they wouldn't be ghosts right now." It was then that Elijah had a change of purpose. He realized that humiliating those poor homeless people to showcase the problem didn't really help them with their problem. This terrible experience set his path in motion. He knew he could make the world a better place on YouTube by way of showcasing acts of kindness on his channel instead. In life, we may never know the lives we touch. Sometimes one gentle word of compassion from a stranger is all it takes to save a life. We may not be able to change the world, but we can change the world for one person, even if just for one day, through a simple act of kindness. So tell me, my loves, have you met someone with a tragic physical condition? Have you ever been in a position where a word of kindness changed your day? Or have you perhaps brightened the world for someone else? Please comment down below and like and subscribe for more fictional stories that are often of actual urban legends and sometimes have historical reference. See you next week and have a good night.